Oh, well, welcome everyone. This is one of the joys of being in ODLAA. We are trying to give back to our membership a bit of what we do, keeping them alive and well, and also, well, making them know that we are alive and well. We have tried this webinar series. This is the second one we've done in in the last 2 months, which is a good thing. And I'm glad to see so many people from across, I would say across the globe, but I can see a large population from the US, which is a good thing. And a few people from Australia. At the moment, I can count 3. I can see Antonina is with us, Julie, and of course myself. And from Fiji, we have got some. So
Mutwata, I think we've lost you.
Yeah, it looks like he's dropped out. So why don't we hand over to you, Son?
Mutwata, thank you, Julie. Mutwata, I think he's stopped talking because I don't see his lips working. By the way, well, it looks like he's listening, right? Because he's smiling. By the way, nobody introduced Mutwata. Mutwata is the president, the current president of the Open and Distance Learning Association of Australia. And both Julie and I are members on the executive. As you know, I'm the executive editor of the journal, been for a long time. So just to put it in context, you know, you might have been wondering who is Mutwata. It's great, as he said, it's great to be here, and it's great to see so many of you with whom we've corresponded over many months, you know, in person. Although we have profiles on it's great to put a face to the name, Mary and Patrick and Zutra, with whom we've been working for the past 18 months, I would say, you know, intensively on getting this issue out. Let me just give a bit of a background, and then I'll hand it over to Mary, because she's going to then orchestrate the rest of the activities for the session. The journal Distance Education is an international journal in the field and fairly well respected. And people like Patrick and I have worked on various other articles in this journal. Thank you, Patrick, for subscribing to the journal and presenting your work to us for publication. The journal is fairly highly regarded. And one of the things that we've been doing over many years now is working on special issues. Special issues, as most of us will know, because we're in this business, gives an opportunity for us to focus on themes of current interest or you know, general interest. And it has the opportunity to explore something in greater detail in a focused way, and also as a result of it, you know, give more prominence to the journal. But we can't overdo this because there's the usual run-of-the-mill articles coming for publication consideration. This year, though, in this volume, we have been a bit more ambitious. We have had 2, as Muto was saying. One that Arash and his colleagues did a while ago on open educational practices. The inquiry about this issue that Mary, Patrick, and Zutra proposed was really titled Criticality and Internet-Mediated Learning Technologies. And I thought that was interesting because the game has shifted, and I'm sure the guest editors would want to probably comment on how their thinking shifted over the past 18 months. And it does take about a year to 18 months to get a good special issue out. So when the request came, I was certainly excited about it, because I'm always interested in a critical look at what we do. So this was an attractive proposition. But boy, I mean, things have changed, haven't they, since the idea was first proposed? COVID-19 has put a wrench in the works in so many ways. So I'm sure that the questions that Mary and her colleagues were thinking about in 18 months ago would have probably shifted ground, and there are different kinds of questions. And I'm hoping that those questions will be asked now as part of this conversation. So enough of me by way of a background. I'm now going to hand it over to Mary, so Mary can then orchestrate the discussion as we have proposed. Mary, over to you.
Hi. Yes, I am Mary Rice. I am a assistant professor of literacy at the University of New Mexico, and of all of the editors, I'm the junior scholar. So it was actually a really important opportunity for me to learn the ropes, right? And also like have good dialogue about this topic, which is really important to me with two people that I really respect quite a lot. And we had over 65 it from there, and we ended up with these really high quality pieces. I'm very excited about that.
Hey, Mary, you froze a little bit. Can you just repeat the statistics again, please?
Oh, yeah, we had just over 65 initial proposals, and we invited 12 people to submit an article. And then from the 12 manuscripts we received, I think we got 10 back from what we invited. And then from there, we went on to publish the issue. And I think there were 5 in the end with the articles. And also, when I was first kind of thinking about this, and when I was inviting Patrick and Zatora to come and do this with me, I was really thinking about the changing landscape of online learning, and I'm a person who favors wide participation, and I just wanted to take a more critical view on it, and I wanted to show people tools, right? I wanted to help people see what was out there. Also, I wanted to honor critical work that was being done and make a space for it, because there seems to be less space for it, or there used to be, than before. And then we had 2020 came, and there were these radical upheavals, both in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic shutting down educational institutions in terms of their buildings, and digital and online and distance resources being more important. And then also there's been civil unrest in the United States, and even in other places, around the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's also very important to acknowledge historical injustice, particularly against communities of color, and to talk about how if we don't do something different online, then we're just going to replicate the same structures that produce historical inequality. And so we got some great articles. And what I would like to do is I have some questions, and I would really like to spend most of the time listening to you all enlighten me. And regarding these topics, Patrick and Zatora and I proposed concepts around criticality that were related to democratization and openness and encounters. And so I'm going to ask some questions about those, and then I'm going to ask questions about future research and frameworks. And so the first question I have, though, is how can researchers and teachers in these distance education settings invite democratization into their distance teaching, both now and then hopefully when the pandemic is over? So what ideas are there out among you? Like, how do we invite that democratization? I will put that in the chat window too.
Can I answer that? Can I start? Okay, awesome. So Uh, I think I refer to this in my paper pretty extensively, but I refer to Peters and Tate, who wrote these texts about how a lot of distance education is focused on providing information to a very large quantity of people in an efficient manner. And that often strays from democratization because it provides language to people in very one-dimensional ways, which can sort of control ideology and education, which are, of course, related to one another. Um, what I feel is that the way we can invite democratization into this is by allowing distance classrooms to become places where students can meet. And the way I approach this is through the lens of cybernetics, which is the way people exercise agency using technology or create these closed tools, which has been the argument behind the creation of the internet itself. So if anybody would like to continue on that, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I often have wondered about, this is Sam here. Hi, Shantanu, good to see you. I loved your paper and bringing in Habermas and cybernetics into it, which is very interesting. I don't know, I've often wondered about this term democratization. People use this very often in relation to open, flexible, and distance education. I wonder if we have some views about what does it really mean? What are we talking about? Is it just a scale thing or what?
I think when we talk about democratization, at least the way my lab looks at it or approaches it is through the lens of Dewey and John Dewey's educational paradigms. And looking how you must consider the perspective of others as this sort of adaptive step towards acquiring knowledge and knowing from the universe. And that's how learning is conceptualized within that paradigm. So I feel that encouraging open conversations and considering those perspectives, especially in classrooms that can allow that, where socially situated knowledge is discussed, allows that potential, and that's how I would look at that.
One of the things that I think that's in my mind is, so what's different about large scale conventional education systems, because the thing that's bearing on my mind, and I'm sure on all of our minds right now, is what is the new normal going to look like? So what are the lessons have we learned for the future? Everybody is now jumping onto online distance education, okay, and people are using it as an emergency response, ERT, or I hate those terminologies, but this is what people are using to refer to what's happening. And what is the new normal? And so how, the question that I suppose an extension of the question that you posed, Mary, is how is the new normal going to unfold, or are we going to go back to where we were? I doubt we would, but what would be the new normal look? What would it look like? And how does democratization feature into it?
Well, I've heard a lot of people speculate about that. Just a second, and then I'll let somebody else was going to talk. But I think it's really important to not just ask what is this going to look like, or how is this going to fall out, but also like, how do we want it? And that is what I learned from that piece about Habermas is the question about not just like what winds are going to come and shape us, but especially thinking about the civil unrest and the Black Lives Matter and like all of these things that are happening offline, and then what's going to happen online. It's like a real opportunity, not just to say what will happen, but like, what do we want to happen? And that definitely goes along with a lot of those ideas from Dewey about intentionality and also using the past. So as a way to think forward into the future.
I think it's really interesting that you bring up that there's been a lot of salient, social issues that have led to these mass upheavals in person as well as online. Like if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been a massive migration of people to applications such as Citizen, which was called Vigilante before. And it's this reporting application where you can create support communities. And while that does create an open environment where we can care for one another in this sort of a situation, there's also a capacity for it to create absolute chaos, which is why I think what I did in my paper was propose the argument that, okay, these online spaces that we see in cyberspace, like even Reddit, with the Boston Marathon bombings and the people responding to those and going on this witch hunt together to search for perpetrators wrongly, if you replicate that within an educational space, that sort of second order communication in an educational space where you can maintain civility and moderate interactions on a smaller scale, I feel that shows potential to allow democratization within infrastructure, which is the idea of a dual layered education.
I was just going to say that sort of my approach and understanding of things is, as I come from the perspective as an instructional designer. So for years, I was fighting faculty to move content online. I mean, Patrick and I are working on a paper on using Flipgrid, and there's this whole process as an instructional designer that we take that, okay, let's do a pilot, let's investigate, let's make sure we have the infrastructure to move forward with certain things. And unfortunately, what COVID has done is it forces into, as Sam said, the emergency remote teaching, ERT, and it's almost thrown the pendulum too far to the right side right now, where like now everyone's online, and they haven't really thought about what does it mean to actually be online. You've got faculty who didn't really think about what the pedagogical implications are of doing this. They didn't think about accessibility wasn't an issue. We've kind of ignored accessibility because, like, look, we don't have time to do X, Y, and Z. We just got to get everything online right now. So I think that while things are online now, it may not actually be a good thing, right? Because there's a lot of bad stuff that's online. So it may be more democratic in the sense that it's open, but it actually, in my opinion, my concern from an instructional design standpoint is it actually may be putting us backwards as a field of instructional design, because so much bad stuff is now online. And like, I'm regularly getting in Facebook arguments with people who are saying, like, we need to lower tuition because classes are online, so therefore tuition should be lower. And it's like, that's not how tuition works. But we're getting those statements. So we talk about democratization. Those comments used to kind of happen with kind of amongst us, the academics, but now it's happening on Facebook. Everyone is talking about it right now, and they don't always have the right information. So sometimes openness is not always a good thing.
So here's a question I have for you, Rob. So, sorry, Mary. Can I just butt in there quickly? Rob, so the question I have for you is, if somebody were to say to you, well, democracy is messy, mate. That's the way it is. Democracy is not dictatorship. It's not a one-way street. It's messy. This is the conversation that I'm kind of grappling with, is that some people say, the classic line that, if something is worth doing, then it's probably worth doing poorly and quickly. Let's do it and get it out. I mean, there's an argument there that is being put forth. And there are people who are actually writing, and I was just reading an article this morning about, for your evening, on EduCourse Review, where people and professors of educational technology, mind you, have argued that remote teaching is a different thing from online distance education. You see, my fear, and I share this with you, Rob, is that if we do these things and it fails, then it comes back and bites us and saying, now you did this, and then you say, oh, it didn't work. You know, you even hear Donald Trump going around saying online education doesn't work. And we have bucket loads of evidence to show that it does work, it can work.
I totally agree with that. I mean, one of the things that we look at is if we look at literally the word democracy, what happens when a country is not a democratic country and you simply go in there and try to throw everything and say you're a democracy tomorrow, right? The number one thing that we do is we look at infrastructure. What is the infrastructure that's going to support that democracy? And my challenge, what I put forth, is that I don't know that we have the infrastructure in place to truly support effective online instruction. And I think some of this pushback is, I mean, Zoom, I mean, that was the whole thing. Zoom went down, what was it, yesterday? And everyone's like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? It's because Zoom wasn't built to support 85 million people online at the same time. I mean, there's just a whole lot of things that we've never considered. I mean, we have situations now with classrooms, like we don't have policies written for it. Like, what happens if someone gets COVID in a classroom? Like, how do you track the fact that that student interacted with 1,000 students in the course of a day just walking across? Like, there's no policy because it's never happened before. So I really think what we're seeing is a lack of infrastructure, and I don't know how we address the infrastructure in the middle of a pandemic, or how we pull it back. Because Sam, I think you're correct. People are talking about online learning is ineffective and is terrible. Like, no, there's literally research. We got things like the Chronicle telling us that like it's Zoom education. It's like, no, it's not. But I digress.
All right, Ramona, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I agree with this sort of perfect storm notion. I also am helpful that this perfect storm has the ability to really just make blatant some inequities. And when professors, at least some that I've been interviewing and working with, are just faced with these inequitable situations that students find themselves in, and have a chance to then reflect and go, wow, I took so much for granted. I think it really gets back to that ideal of democracy, and when they see it fall apart, like whether it's Zoom going down, or students learning in a closet because it's the only safe place they have to learn, or learning from their phones because they don't have another device. Some of the interviews I've been doing recently, people are just really humbled, I guess is one word. And so I do agree that it's a perfect storm for disaster, but I have seen bright spots when professors haven't been able to look the other way, haven't been able to just assume all their students are the same because they're all sitting with, backpacks and clothes on in their classroom. And so I'm hopeful that as the inequitable access to internet and devices and all of that just kind of hit people in the face, hit professors in the face, that it's an opportunity to really humanize our students and then and address those inequities. Not that we can solve them, but at least that we can, first step, recognize them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good lead into kind of the next topic for thinking about the most pressing issues in distance education in terms of accessibility, and then sort of other elements that way. So, because I think the most important thing, one of the most important things right now, is to make sure that all communities who want access to the internet have it. And it's too bad that was so political, like going all the way down, because the federal government's been giving money for internet infrastructure for years, but unfortunately most of it was funneled into only a few states. And then there were states like Idaho who actually put their own money up for a lot of their internet infrastructure, but they're still working on it. And so, there's just making sure everybody's got the internet, making sure everybody's got devices. But then how do we do that, and what are some other issues?
One issue I'm really interested in is, and it's so funny that we're turning our cameras off right now, just to be able to free up so it doesn't crash or stall. But I think I've heard so many of my friends just, oh no, camera has to be on, because if not, I don't know what they're doing or what they're learning. And, just, I think that's a fascinating assumption for us to examine. Like, yeah, why do I insist that my students have their camera on? What are the reasons they might want to have it off, or things like that? I think that's an important one, and it's one that I think reveals, again, so many equity issues that, people maybe like me would never consider. Like, what? Of course I can have my camera on at all times, because I get to edit and present the way I am and the way I look, and put a virtual background on so you don't really see where I am. But I think it reveals the camera on, camera off debate, I think, is a really one that could lead to some self-reflection along equity and democracy issues.
Very much so. I mean, I'll jump in on that. It's just some research that, Rob and I've done, but I've done some other stuff on just use of Zoom, and how, for a long time, and this would be even where I challenge kind of Rob's, or why I'm excited with this kind of where we're shaking things up a little, is because we still kind of gotten lazy where we think there's one type of quality online learning. And like in the States, does it meet all the quality matters things? Does it do this, and that? And I think sometimes we get stuck in this way of, well, no, this is how you do it. This is, we figured this out. We know how to do it. You can't do it like this. But I do think that this hopefully will give us opportunities. And I'd love to see an issue like this a year from now or 2 years from now as kind of in retro reflection, how have things kind of shifted? Because if we did the call today, I think we'd get different things than we did. But the thing that's come up before is, people's issues of, their only device maybe is their phone, and being on Zoom, let's say, on your phone is different than being on your computer. Or what does the camera reveal about, we talk about it makes us seem more human, but what else does it reveal from my, the apartment I live, where I live? Am I in the closet? Is there dirty clothes? Who knows what? But that it can, for me, what it goes back to is one of the things that got me really interested in this, and I've really enjoyed Mary's work through the last few years, is that a lot of the people who need online learning the most, the people who have disabilities, challenges, whatever it might be, are sometimes the ones we serve the least successfully. And so for me, I wonder about how just this issue of even camera reveals things. I've had a student in one of my classes, she really didn't like the camera. She's in a wheelchair. And one of the things she loves about online is, no one knows she's in a wheelchair. I didn't know she was in a wheelchair until I met her at a conference. I'm like, oh, okay. It didn't matter. But it was just something that the camera, just as it reveals, it takes away. I don't know. And so I think it's this fascinating thing to think about. In the States, the K-12 schools are shut down. They're also having dress codes. And I've had this thing where people reveal too much, like adults. And then they have this thing of, I have a 15-year-old daughter. And so they're talking about dress codes, and dress codes being this kind of weird thing. And so I think that the camera thing is just fascinating. I could talk all day on that, but I'll let others jump in. And I see there's something going on in the text.
No, I was talking about how I've done 3 webinars today, and so I keep going, running, and changing shirts. now I'm in this space, right? Because it was recorded. And so then it's permanent. And I'm like, if people try and watch these things, and are they going to think I only have one shirt? Like,
I was wearing a t-shirt. Yeah. I had to put a collar on for this.
So, and yes, actually thinking about how students with disabilities who went online had the option of revealing and not revealing initially. And as video has become more a part of online learning, then all of a sudden it feels like they have less control over that. And there's implications in that, one, it might be really useful for inclusion purposes to help students without disabilities see their peer, right, participating, but then also the choice, right, and the agency involved is interesting.
And I think another issue with cameras is just their surveillance notion. You know, just being able to surveil every, and then critique, and, you know, because we're just present. And you know, what else do we have to stare at except for each other? And you don't want to go there, and you certainly don't want to as a professional, but I think so many assumptions. I'm doing some other work with mother scholars who have been quarantined at home with their children. And, you know, the notion of just, oh, there goes the professional facade because I got a kid running behind me in diapers, or, you know, whatever. So that notion of surveillance, I think, is really tied in too.
And that's something I've seen come up a little bit about, like this whole concept of like no kids being on the webcam during class and stuff. And even though I definitely think that big picture we do have some infrastructure things, but speaking specifically about like my classes and my interaction with the students, I know that like my dress has completely changed, right? You know, because there was a period where it's like, make sure I look nice when I go to campus and stuff like that. But since COVID happened, we're deciding what hoodie we're going to wear for the meeting, and we have kid and pet time at the end of every one of our classes, and I think the students like that more than they like the lecture part. So I've actually found that sometimes we put some of these rules in place that don't really have any basis for anything. I mean, there's nothing wrong with, in my opinion, a kid being on his headphones behind the parent because they're doing their schoolwork. Like, why do we need to remove them from the room, kind of thing? As long as the baby's not screaming and yelling, and it's not distracting, I think sometimes we have these rules that we've imposed in this new space that aren't really based on anything, that further make things more of a challenge for some of our students.
For me, as someone who teaches around race, class, and gender in online education, and around issues like gender identity and sexualities, part of the problem with using, part of what I teach the faculty that'll be teaching online is that they should consider the cultural capital that students are bringing to their classroom when they're teaching online, and valuing that, bringing that into the center of what's happening in the online environment, but also that they be cognizant that when they require people to be on Zoom chats for a synchronous meeting, there's more issues at play and more things they should consider beyond just the fact of whether the timing is right, like the time is right. Because I have students that are transgendered that feel oppressed by others in the classroom if they have to reveal themselves on a camera when they were safe not doing so before all of the we have to put everything on Zoom happened. And so they felt safe in the online environment because they didn't have to identify themselves in ways that define them around binaries, around gender. And they didn't have to put up pictures, they didn't have to do any of that. But now, so many of their faculty are requiring them to be in online environments, and there is no consciousness about the how critical it is for us to be aware of gender identity and what that means for some students. Not everyone wants to be revealed in an online class when all they're trying to do is get their degree. The same is true for students of color who previously were able to participate in the class without their racial identity being guessed or being talked about in the class. And now, in the midst of all that's been happening here in the United States, at least, around the protests around the country, around the world, but specifically around the country, them now being the one in their class that needs to answer all the questions about racism, the one in their class that needs to be the speaker for their whole race. And that very much happens now with everything being pushed online in the online environment, where students are now revealed to be thought of as a certain race because the coloring of their skin. And now they have to become the authority for racism in the protest. So all of those things, I think, are encompassed in what we were talking about when we chose to talk about criticalities and those issues that don't normally get talked about when we're talking about distance education. It's more than learning management systems. It's also about what are those critical conversations that we need to have around identities and the reality that our students are facing in an online environment where, you know, a lot of faculty are just putting on their photocopies of their colored notes that contain rather inappropriate and racist statements.
Mary, can I just throw in a thought there, because this is fascinating as I was listening to Zutra and other people, Patrick. A lot of so much of this is coming back at us that in a cyclical way. I mean, in the early days, 20 years ago, when we were getting used to the idea of text-based discussion forums, the same sorts of issues were coming out. How some people can actually found it liberating along the lines that Patrick is saying, that you could sit on your computer and write whatever you wanted to write. But on the other hand, it's the same old thing that those who wrote more or wrote quickly would overpower the others. And there was some research done in the Australian context that people who had difficulty being able to articulate their thoughts would agonize over one post all day. Whereas, other people who could write more easily would just, blabber away and pound lines and lines of text. So much of this is coming again at us in so many different ways. And we're familiar with video as well. I mean, from the days of educational television, how best to be used. But the point that I really wanted to make is to pick up on your point about openness, and it goes to the heart of some of the paper that Rob wrote about Hutoguchi, and I don't even know how to pronounce that word properly. How does openness play out, in terms of access, not only in terms of access and accessibility, but in terms of equity? And I think we are talking about that in terms of how to help people who are disabled, disadvantaged, but in hampered in so many other different ways. So the issue of equity is certainly part of openness. But it's a slippery slope, isn't it? I cringe at words like open pedagogy and open science, because I like to think, wait a minute, science hasn't become open. What has really become open is how we practice science. There is no such thing as open science or open pedagogy. Pedagogy is pedagogy. Aren't we? Pardon me, Mary, but this is a session on criticality, so I'm asking some hard questions, I guess.
Could I say something? What's interesting to me is we've been talking for about 25 minutes, and almost all of the conversation has been about Zoom and cameras. And this even goes back to something Sam was saying earlier, like 20 years ago, people didn't write that much, and writing was really different. That a lot of what's difficult right now is people are trying to recreate face-to-face online and I think this has gone on for a while, recreate face-to-face or recreate the traditional way we do education online. And what we're running into is online is a really, really different tool. And you can't really recreate it. And you can't really recreate the face-to-face way of going about education. And we need to try and explore different ways of education, understanding the way the world is changing around us. So I thought about this when Sam was saying, well, 20, how quickly do you write? But today, students grew up in a world of writing online, grew up in a world of texting, grew up in a world of communicating and writing online. And what frightens me a little bit is universities aren't adapting to that. Universities aren't adjusting to the different way people are communicating and engaging and learning from each other. One of the things that I found pretty amazing is, well, not really that amazing, it's kind of extraordinary, is the incredible depth and the incredible ability, nuanced ability of Black Lives Matter to create these protests all over the country, get people together, you know, coordinate things, create like these different types of how, what are we going to say to the government, and how are we, and to do it all completely. There's really no leaders of Black Lives Matter. To do it all in a completely grassroots, distributed way. And I feel like a lot in, especially with Zoom and the one-to-one type of, and the face-to-face, and there's a camera on, and what are you doing? We're not adjusting, we're not using these skills and these abilities that our students, many of our students are developing, and we're not adapting to the way the world is evolving through these tools.
I think it's really interesting that Michael brings that up, because we were actually having a conversation with our faculty just all together while working on a project, just talking about how there's a lot of generalizations people make, drawing comparisons between online and face-to-face interactions, and there's been very little research to sort of understand those differences in depth. Especially with COVID arising and everything just suddenly going online, I feel like this is a time where, like Michael said, we need to sort of do something from the grassroots in a distributed manner, but also do it iteratively and understand that there are going to be these sort of anomalies that we face on the way, but adopting research methodologies to sort of take those anomalies and treat them as, like I said, within the framework of pragmatism, as adaptive steps towards better results for after the pandemic. And what you guys were saying about, you know, writing an issue maybe next year about saying, okay, how did this turn out? I feel like the process towards that and the journey towards seeing what that looks like is very adaptive, and it needs to be done keeping that warranted assertability in mind.
Yeah, and I like to chime in on this too. I'm actually working with Shantanu and Michael. And going back to one of the first questions we talked about, which is what is online instruction going to look like? I think it's really important to address the issue of how teachers are unwilling to give up their control of the classroom. So I think one of the main reasons why teachers come up with all of this policies, like you have to have your camera on, you have to be doing certain things, you know, no pets, kids, whatever, is because they lost, because of online instruction, they lost the main control mechanism, which is seeing everyone at the same time in the same place. But do we really want the teacher to be the main control hub, or do we want the teacher to be the facilitator, right? And the philosophy of John Dewey is basically all about moving towards teachers giving up their control of the classroom in productive ways, obviously, and sort of helping students understand how they can learn from each other and from the larger society. So my concern right now is that I'm seeing a lot of classes that use Zoom in a very hierarchical, traditional way, right? So here's my Zoom lecture, here are a couple of assignments, and we're just gonna do the same thing over and over again. We're just gonna do it online because we can be in person. Sure. And I think it's very dangerous. So what do you think about how we as researchers and practitioners and administrators can address this issue?
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that pops into my mind, Irena, is just this notion of trusting our students to be knowers. I almost think that that's could be one of the first steps. In my own experience, my students just kept coming up with these amazing pop cultural artifacts that completely helped teach what I was trying to teach. And I realized, oh yeah, knowledge production. I'm not supposed to be the, you know, dictator of all knowledge. And but that takes a certain amount of trust of our students to be knowers and to be more expert, certainly, than a middle-aged woman like me, at least, on oh, what's happening on Snapchat or on, you know, whatever social media. So I'm interested in that notion of how can we come to trust our students as knowers.
And that's actually one of the things that I looked at in my paper, looking at a continuum, going from left to right, with pedagogy be on the left, then andragogy in the middle, and then I pronounce it pedagogy. That may be wrong, but I'm just going to go with it. But the graphic, if I could share my screen, I would, but it would probably break Zoom at this point. But in my paper, the graphic that I used that we came up with was literally a water faucet, right? And the water faucet was learner autonomy, right? So the more learner autonomy, the more they move from left to right. So in a pedagogical approach, it's very structured, like you do this at this time. And as you move from left to right, you get more and more autonomy. So to sort of answer Irina's question, one of the things that, I mean, I've been looking at with my own class is, why are we doing these assignments? Like, what's the purpose of this particular assignment? If the requirement from accreditation, which is a big factor, is that, you know, the doctoral students need to write a 15-page paper or demonstrate some type of writing, why do I need to tell them what they're writing about? Why can't they have more control over picking it? So I literally gave my students 4 different options. And I said, look, I just need you to pick what you want to do. Do you want to write a conference paper? Do you want to write a journal article? Do you want to do a lit review? Or do you want to learn about the peer review process? You tell me what you want to do, and then we'll figure out how to make that fit within the constraints of the class. It's more work on the instructor, but I think it better serves the students. So it's that balancing act of how do you give those opportunities to the students, but still meet those accreditation issues that you have, the dean that wants to make sure that, hey, they're meeting certain things. So how do you do that? And it's a lot of work on the instructor, and not every instructor is able or willing to make those sacrifices.
Well, and Rob, it so disproportionately hits people who are pre-tenure or other more vulnerable populations in academia, because we're not rewarded in terms of most tenure review processes for our teaching innovations and things like that. So it becomes out of hide.
I'm definitely pre-tenure, so I hope it goes well. So
just as long as you write an article about it in a tier 1 journal, it'll be okay.
Hey, this is education, a tier 1 article, isn't it? I think I
right.
See, yeah, I'm good to go now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Education.
My dossier pocket. Thank you.
Yes. Well, and I really appreciate the conversation here about just thinking about how to, if we're going to move pedagogies over, then let's move our strong ones too, rather than our most coercive, least engaging. And also I appreciate the conversation as it's evolved around diversity and thinking carefully about encounters, right, with diversity and what ways they would be meaningful, and you know, like not asking the person of color in the Zoom meeting to represent a bunch of people, to represent everyone with their same skin tone. That's not necessarily a meaningful encounter. And so then those things that we need to be doing instead, right, both as teachers and researchers, and figuring out like really how we're going to optimize this space. So, and that's in the chat box too. So like, how can we design either research or pedagogy to kind of capture the nuance of what would be a really important encounter?
Can I say something about that, Mary? I recently received, I get this all the time. People write and say, I've got this paper, would you be interested in it? So this came from California somewhere, and it was sort of focused on the use of video as a technology for enhancing emotion, because the argument was that emotion is somehow or the other, well, not somehow or the other, is connected to motivation and therefore learning. So I had a bit of a conversation with the authors and said, like, it'd be better to start with the idea of emotion. You know, lead off with emotion and say, why is emotion important? How is it important? How does it help motivation and drive learning and teaching and so on? And then show how whatever technology, voice activated technology or not, you were able to use to show that you can enhance emotion. And so this goes to the point that you raised in this question is, how do you capture the nuances in terms of research? So, and it's amazing that you said earlier on, Mary, that you received 65 expressions of interest and only 5 of them got through, which says something about the quality of research in the field, isn't it? Why are people missing the mark so much? And why are people not focusing on what is important and then being sidetracked? I mean, another example was the other day when in another meeting, somebody was saying, oh, no, let's go, how about we use television, you know, broadcast television or video on demand? Without asking the obvious question that, you know, people in this community will know that, with the first question, you should have, where is the need? Where is the gap? Where is the deficit? And what is the deficit? What is the gap? And then ask how it might be dealt with. So I suppose in so many ways I'm addressing your question of how do you capture the nuances of these encounters? Hey, Mary.
And well, with the proposals, a lot of people thought if they just mentioned diverse folks in some way, that inherently meant they were doing critical work. And so we have 2 pieces, right? We were trying to do work with diversity, and we were also trying to do work with criticality. And the criticality was very difficult for people to grab, you know, and we actually, and it was really important to have 3 of us there, as I recall, going through all of those proposals, because what somebody may have missed, another person would catch, right, in terms of thinking about, well, is this really represent a critical investment in this population, or is this somebody who's colonizing, right? Because we didn't want to publish something in an issue about criticality that actually was a representation of colonization at the end of the day. And so really, like, Carol Gilligan talks about the listening guide, and I've used it a lot as an analytical framework I did for my dissertation and other things, but like really trying to hear what people are saying, particularly behind their academic writing, and trying to tease out some of those issues and thinking about who they're citing and how they're referring to the people that they are referring to. I myself would have liked to publish a couple more empirical sort of studies with human subjects, but like I said, there was a lot of stuff that that just didn't pass the threshold.
And then there were a couple that sounded good, and then when we finally saw them, it was like, oof, all right, no, this isn't going to work either. So there was some of that too that I think happened, but and I think it's probably so much of what we do. We just do the same old research. We have the same old looking courses that look the same, act the same. And so I think that kind of gets to this question of number 3 is, well, you know, how do we get there? You know, as educators, as researchers, you know, for me, it might be in my own classes to not just, you know, have students read the same old dead white guys, right? It might be that I just start there with having different voices, even in the readings and this and that, and not necessarily everything that I agree with, right? And because so often we like to just have the stuff we like, you know, and so I think there's a lot of ways we can get diversity and criticality into the courses we teach, but it does usually take intention and effort and time.
I think that's so good, Patrick, what you're saying about intentionality. Like, we can have all of the best intentions, but our actions have to match those intentions.
Yes.
As we're doing critical design in our courses, as we're doing design in our courses, and as we're looking from a student's perspective on how do we learn in this online environment, And when you invite conversations for diversity, invite conversations and knowledge around criticalities, it's so, so important for us to be willing to be open to new possibilities and being really able to critique our own selves about what we always do and what we already know, and really being open to that. And I think as we're going through the selection of articles for this journal, I think we did exactly what you're both talking about. We not only looked at what was being presented to us, but also what was our positionality and where were we standing in that positionality as we were looking through and reviewing the articles. And so I think all that's really important when we're talking about the invitation to come from diverse and critical perspectives in our online courses.
I just wanted to respond to that. I think it's really interesting that Dr. Rice and Dr. Lowenthal brought up the idea that there's this thin line between using democratization to create actual change and sort of using it for self-interest, or for, you know, it turns into colonization, like you said. And I feel like this sort of spills over into our classrooms as well, because what we're trying to do is trying to get our students to engage with the highest level of scientific inquiry in our classrooms. And the way to do that is, like Dr. Lowenthal said, is not to introduce topics that we like. I might consider myself to align with a certain political party, but that doesn't mean that I have to put forward those views to people, because at the end of the day, that becomes me feeding knowledge to people in a one-dimensional way. So the generators that we use to sort of spark those discussions need to be very well thought out and objective for us to actually engage criticality in a classroom, I feel.
Yeah, just to build on exactly what you said, I think, at least personally for me, it so much involves giving up my need to be right, giving up my need to, you know, this is how it is, and really being willing to go. I mean, you know, and then there's always the moral tension of like, wait, no, I really am right. But just being willing to, okay, you know what? I don't have to be right. I'm not gonna, you know, stand down from what my moral commitment is to, you know, whatever the topic is. But I'm gonna try and open a space that I don't have to always be right.
I feel like that also calls upon the idea of the learning community, or the teacher as a facilitator that we were talking about, because once you dive into that instinct to say that you are right, you create a hierarchy in some way by modeling students' thinking. But there has to be, I feel like there has to be a balance between giving students unbridled freedom in a classroom and giving them infrastructure, which is what Dr. Naidu was saying about, you know, design being the key. And I feel like there has to be many aspects brought into design to make it ideal. We can't just stick to one or the other.
No, that's what that makes me think of. Even like things are happening in Idaho specifically, but across the U.S. and the world. But we talk about democratization, giving people voices, but often as educators, we want certain types of voices, right? I don't want the loud racists in my class. And so I think that it's tricky work sometimes, depending on the courses you teach and what you do, is how you facilitate and how you kind of balance power. And you don't want to have a situation where it's not a trusting environment where people don't respect each other. And so it's still, I get to why sometimes people are afraid of, right, being a little too critical or letting go of control completely. And I think we find it, especially at the younger grades. You know, I know that when watching, you know, my daughter do her high school online, yeah, they're doing Zoom and there's reasons they can control, there's this and that, but this is like the first couple of weeks. If they end up having to do this all semester, I believe in the creativity of these teachers, that they're going to do better, they care, and they're interesting things will happen if we give time and let, you know, but this kind of giving up control, it's scary stuff, you know, and it's scary when stuff can be recorded and everyone can see it, and, you know, the list goes on, but I think that that's what we need to try to do is, you know, give students more control, especially the older they get, for sure. Some would say at all ages.
Yeah, I think I agree that teachers are a creative bunch. I saw on Instagram the other day Elmer's glue, where you write a smiley face, and then when you unscrew the glue, then the smiley face isn't aligned, and when it's screwed, when it's closed properly, then it's a smiley. And I'm like, that's classic teacher genius, you know, like, and I'm sure that's coming to online learning, but unfortunately, with technology integration in general, even before online, and especially what's happening right now, I think teachers had valid concerns about technology integration that were mostly ignored. And usually in the discourse that shows up as resistance, like teachers are resistant to technology. And I really thought it was a lot of it was about them having their concerns not acknowledged, and some of those things they were calling out in terms of access and infrastructure and things like that. We've seen the ways in which they're correct. And so, and actually the internet in Albuquerque Public Schools, which is where I live, it was down for most of the morning today within the network. And so teachers who went to the school building to try and teach remotely to not use their own Wi-Fi data right at their house, not use their own internet data, then found that they couldn't teach their kids. And so they've got to figure out if they're going to run home, if they're going to, you know, try and use their cell data or whatever. And these are all things that have concerned teachers for a long time. And so, so I hope that also this will lead to some better listening as well. So not just in K-12, but in higher ed too, because online learning in higher ed has also had a slow start. Not as slow as K-12, but it's had a slow start. So, and then the next question actually is, leads into this well. It says, what's missing from current research and pedagogical conversations about criticality and diversity? And we started to address this a little bit and thinking about that fine line between colonization, you know, like what seems like it's easy to step over that. I just mentioned some things about historically teachers raising issues and then being painted as resistant rather than listening to them. Research methodologies and making sure that the research methodologies that embrace openness and democracy and all these things can get into tier 1 journals. So I think that's an important thing to think about too. And who's going to provide the mentorship for doing that kind of research and for producing the record of it, right? Which is the article and whatever else.
I think we've touched on some of this, right, already. So, like, even if we, you know, back to appreciating Michael's comment earlier, but back to video, is that it's easy for us to get obsessed with the new shiny object. You know, I think that there's a balance between that and giving voices to old ways. I mean, I know that just as there's, you know, I've had colleagues who they're painted as being Luddites or real traditional online teachers because they don't want to use media or video. But some of them, they have real concerns about accessibility and making things accessible to other learners, or referencing and valuing that sometimes, you know, that mother with the kid right there, it's always been happening. It's just before it was text. So you didn't see the 3 kids and this and that. I mean, so some of this is how do we tell the stories of some of the important stories about, you know, why isn't distance learning or online learning working for some people? Why is it struggling? You know, for me, I'm one of those that I love online learning. I'm like, it could work for everyone. Just give us time. We could figure it out. And it's like, well, it's not really, right? And so if I'm really honest with myself, and it's like, why won't it work? When doesn't it work? You know, when are faculty being forced and nudged into something that's not their strength? And I mean, so I think there's just a lot of stories and voices that were just, and I don't know if they're just not told or studied because they're not popular, or if they're small minority voices that we don't hear enough, as in they're not the dominant voice. I don't mean minority as, you know, in any other kind of way, but you know, but for me, one of the things that's missing with the research is I think we need to do more design-based research where we try something, we iteratively collect stuff over time. It's hard because it takes time and we're not promoted on time. I mean, we got to go. But I think that there's lots of opportunities to try to do new things, innovative things to design intentionally and collect data over time and improve it. So I don't know.
Thanks, Patrick. There's a bunch of faculty members here, so let me put the pressure back onto the faculty members because I went to grad school some time ago. So one of the things I'm finding as a journal editor is the lack of rigor in research methodology. And oftentimes I'm wondering what are students learning these days who are coming out of grad school? Is there a problem with that? Are we critical enough about the methodology? I mean, this whole debate between positive paradigms and alternative paradigms, you know, I don't care which camp you are in as long as you are rigorous and systematic. And the second part of your question, Mary, was, you know, how do you get this thing out? And I think journals, journal editors, and those kinds of fora are critical, and this is exactly what I'm trying to do. We've been trying to do with this kind of an issue, to get this kind of conversation out to the readership. I've often found, for example, that you know to be a tier 1 journal, you have to publish those kinds of sort of, you know, experimental research, if not experimental, very rigorous data-based research. And I found that there was no opportunity within that kind of context for people to sort of go out on the limb and sort of, you know, rant on about something. And so I created a little section in the journal called Reflections and Reports alongside book reviews and report. One could, you know, go off on a tangent and bitch about something, if I can use that word, or complain about something. Although even that too, in a rigorous way, not just complain about something, but support your argument with thoughts and not necessarily rigorous data. So in response to your question, you know, I think how we and Patrick did talk about design-based research, which gets to the heart of the matter. You know, how do we approach research, and how rigorously we approach research? I mean, I suspect that a large number of the articles that you received, and I know this from my experience, is that they lack research rigor. And this is my complaint and my problem. So from a faculty point of view, what do you think is happening?
One of the things that I'm seeing is I am seeing, this is specifically for U.S. institutions, is I'm seeing that schools that are R2, R3 are very, very concerned about enrollments. And because of being concerned about enrollments, they are sometimes a bit more lax on who they're admitted into their program. And sometimes their classes are bigger, and sometimes they have students with a more diverse backgrounds and interests in what they're trying to do with their degree. And I think that sometimes impacts how hard of a class it can be. Whereas at some other schools that are more restrictive on their admissions, they're able to get smaller classes, students who are really, really like, I'm going to this school because I want to be a faculty member. So they're really focused on that. And I think that in turn can result in some of those discrepancies you're seeing with the type of rigor of the scholarship is published, because not everyone's getting a PhD to be a faculty member. Not everyone's getting a PhD to go to a top tier institution to do heavy research. And I think that in turn impacts how the instruction is being delivered, and also how it's being received, and ultimately how it's being used.
I think another issue that's related to that from people who are already faculty, Patrick, you were talking about really rigorously studying experience, and you didn't use the word, but almost exposing the humanity of all of us as students, as faculty members. And I think that epistemologically, sometimes when we study experience, I personally come from a self-study background, and definitely rigorous and systematic, but also a methodology that could be considered untraditional or unfamiliar maybe. and not showing up in, publication outlets that, that get prestige and attention. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I so really agree with you, Patrick, about that need to study experience, but then epistemologically, what does that, translate into within the existing framework of academia that often says rigorous and systematic means, objective and whatever.
Mhm.
There's no question that if you just look at least in the US, if you want funding, a lot of the NS funding, the best funds, are for a certain type of IES. They want a certain type of research. They want controlled trials. They want this certain stuff that, to me, it's not the type of research I value or do. But I do think that there could be good research done that way. So it's not that I don't want to, but I do think that there's this kind of tension between there's some big funded research and sometimes they do some really neat large scale stuff, but then there's a lot of research that I find that it seems like people are just doing it for the article, not for the knowledge generation or for what they're and so this is going to sound bad, but like it lacks heart or just substance. It's just bleh. And so I think that, part of, but I think also part of some thing is that, how do we give students, grad students, enough practical, authentic experience? I think sometimes even research their own things. I think sometimes they get grabbed onto just doing what their advisor's doing because that's the only option. And sometimes that's definitely not it, just like with any students, right? This kind of even goes back to Rob's comment about, do you give students choice? You just tell them to do what to do, and I think that we could probably give our, when we mentor, do a better job of giving choice and agency, even when it comes to choosing your own research, and going in different methodologies too, than say what I'm comfortable with, because I tend to do certain type of stuff. And so how do we mentor and do that in other ways?
Yeah, I think we talked at the beginning of the issue, like I said, I don't have it in my head that there's a particular methodology associated 100% all the time with criticality. So like it wasn't escapable to me that someone could have done a quantitative study, but I think it's harder. I think it's harder to conceptualize and things like that. It tends to be more of not even the qualitative, but the post-qualitative, even in thinking about these issues of criticality. And also I teach advanced qualitative methods sometimes for my university. And I've actually taught the intro class too. And what I've noticed is that a lot of the students, as they come in, they haven't, as Patrick said, had the opportunity to ever really ask their own questions that for whatever reason. And also that there is this sense that if you're going to do qualitative work, it's only like good qualitative work if it's qualitative work that's just sort of just over the line from quantitative. Because the way that I teach it is that rather than sitting in a box as a methodology, that there's a continuum that is based on critical questions about the relationship between the participants and the researcher and the way in which data is obtained. And there's just some touchstones, there's some touch points. And then that builds across a continuum rather than something being hard line this and then, oh, you've crossed over into that line. And so to help them understand kind of that nuance and also to go back and read foundational stuff. I think that if you're going to do qualitative work, then you've got to spend your time with Husserl and Heidegger and and really figure out where you sit in those places. And then if you want to leave them for something more, then fine. But I notice as an editor for this and other journals that a lot of times, like, people won't really say where they're even situated theoretically. And I think that is a big problem in that we've got to help people figure out, first of all, what are their own questions? And second of all, like, where do they really sit? And so those things are important to me.
I think those. Sorry, Rob, you go ahead, man.
The other thing I was going to say too is also it's all about experiences, right? So I had a good program that I went through, but I had never done a systematic review before. So even during going through this process, Mary and I went back and forth on you need to make this change or change that, and I learned through the process. So I think that's another issue that comes up is that I know I'm now doing like 4 or 5 systematic reviews right now and able to teach my students how to do it. And the reason why I can do that is because I went through this experience. But if I hadn't had this opportunity, then my students wouldn't know where to go. So I think part of it is just kind of getting exposure. And if you're not exposed to it, you don't know what you don't know, basically. So it ends up being a challenge that sometimes students, new early career researchers don't know that they don't know how to do something. And you kind of have to go through a process sometimes to learn it and then sort of pass that on. But not everyone, I mean, as Mary said, most of the people didn't make it through that didn't make it through that cut, right? So they didn't get the benefit of having that experience to then disseminate it out. So the tree kind of stops there. So I think it's all about opportunities and for our students trying to figure out ways to give them these opportunities. So we talk about as faculty what we do. This experience that I can own that I've improved is why I make, like, it's actually a requirement for all of my doc students. They are required to submit things for review every single year they're in the program, because the only way for them to learn how to do the research is to do the research. So I push them, and it's hard for some of them, but that's part of the process. So they go through the rejections, they go through peer review. I really think that's the only way that we can hope to teach them this process, because as all of us know, that peer review thing is a magical beast sometimes, and the only way to learn about it is to go through it.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You can talk for some.
I just wanted to add that I think the journals play a very important role here by, positively reinforcing and negatively punishing, so to speak, in behaviorist terminology about what it publishes and what it doesn't publish. And I think I have certainly followed the line that, I don't care which camp you come from, but as long as you do it rigorously. And so many of the articles, and I'm sure you'll support me on this one, come, with such poor design, with a small case study here, or a small number of people or sample size somewhere, and making generalizations based on that. And a lot of the time, these are desk rejections based simply on that. And I think that is a problem. And I cringe every time, because I feel like, you're letting people down without spending the time to give them the kind of feedback that they would require. But that requires other kinds of resources. So I think the journals play a very important role in promoting the kind of research that I think, or you think, should be happening.
Yeah, I agree with that too. I was going to talk about thinking about editors and the big role that they play in encouraging new work, as also, maintaining the important elements of the academy. Also, I think reviewers play a really big role in that too. And that one thing we could do to really help is do a better job of helping people understand how to review well, and also to get more people involved in reviewing. I often talk about how every time you submit an article, so 3 people or maybe 4 or so have to review it. And so that means you need to review, right, 3 or 4 articles every time you submit something. And a lot of people don't understand that exchange. And the other thing is that I'm the program chair for the Online Teaching and Learning SIG of AERA. And from doing that, and from working on other journals, either doing special issues or being an assistant editor, I know who the review pool is. And by and large, it is women and people of color. But the people who are the most successful in those venues of getting published and in making into the program are not necessarily women and people of color. And so it's very important as well that, like, if you identify, for instance, as a male from the majority white race, that you go sign up to do your reviewing as well, because women and people of color are helping you publish and giving you the opportunity to present and to think about your work in new ways. And so we all have to pull in on that. And so I think that's important too, to also to do the educating about what the review process is really like and who's doing it as a matter of criticality. And then also with grad students and with new scholars, and even as we move down the line, to help people understand what that review process should be like, you know, as an important conversation to hold people to high standards, because we definitely did as we moved down to our finalists in publishing, but also to give people concern and care and mentoring and modeling. All right, we're down to our last 9 minutes now, so this is very exciting. I'm trying to decide which question to end on. If we just want to talk about something freely, we totally can, but this is the last one I had, and that's what do we want to say, or what would we like to say, to speak to policy at various levels, institutional, state, and more, while considering how to make distance learning viable and accessible for all the learners. So how are we going to talk outside of the academy?
You've got to replace the voice of Apple with the voice of people doing research. So this actually goes back a couple of comments ago. One of the things that drives me crazy at my university, and I believe they're having so much trouble, is that everybody in the Office of Distance Education gets taken to Cupertino and wined and dine, and then comes back like an Apple file, and everything about education is about Apple. Right now, the people, it seems, with the most voice are the large, big tech companies. And somehow and I don't know how you do that, but somehow it's got to become the people who are actually down in the trenches doing the work and sometimes failing, but not looking to make a profit off of distance education.
I just want to add on to that. We were actually discussing this book, Computer Lab, the other day in our lab, which talks about 1975 as the first segue into computer underground culture, when the Altair 8800 was created, which is like this cheap prototype of $1,000 computer. And we were actually having this argument about how today, the postmodern era, where everything is so post-truth and there are these grassroots movements, this is the second conduit that we have into these opportunities. And I feel like it's an opportune time to look at platforms and tools that we can use. I'm not saying to encourage underground culture in our classrooms, but to sort of replicate that in a moderated manner, so that we, like Dr. Catrice said earlier about, you know, students bringing popular culture references and helping her make pedagogy possible and more relatable. I feel like that draws on Vygotsky so much, because he always says, you know, there are these scientific concepts and there are these mandates that we give to people, but there are these everyday concepts that come from popular culture, and we need to bring those into the classroom to encourage that segue into such communication.
Or one thing I've tried to do is just not talk about it as Zoom, for instance, like just call it video conferencing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
right? Not call it an iPad, call it a tablet, or just things like that. I think is a small shift I've tried to make in the last 2 or 3 years. I
I think what you said about, calling it a tool rather than something associated with a corporation that, creates these shallow communities based on advertisements and algorithms. Really, like you said, like an iPad becomes a surface on which someone can exercise human agency to make concept maps or, create these ideas. So it doesn't only become about the tools, it becomes about how you are able to direct the agency of the students using those tools. Tools can be imported from one classroom to another in different ways, but the way you structure what's happening there actually is what matters.
One of the obvious things, I think, if I can take the classic line from popular press, is listen to the science. Why are we jumping and at things as if we are drowning? There's no need to, because we know how technology works. There's been decades of research, and this group will know better. So I think the public forums such as journals and graduate programs around education, educational technology, computer science, should be banging on and on about the fact that we don't have to take a shortcut. We know what are the good principles, of open, flexible learning and teaching. There is very little that we haven't explored. There's a lot that's been explored, and there's bucket loads of literature. It's like we suddenly don't have to jump on and start talking about remote teaching when the idea of learning and teaching online and distance education has existed. It's just like somehow the other people, nothing existed. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. I think we have to keep on. And this is where professional associations and journals and the academic community have a role to play. You just have to keep on at it.
Yes, for sure. And to really hold people accountable. So I remember maybe some of you remember the ACOT studies, the Apple Computers of Tomorrow, and they published a lot of stuff, and they were some of the architects even behind the teachers are resistance rhetoric to technology. And then one of the leaders of that project later, wrote a very small article in Educational Leadership, which is a practitioner journal, saying, those teachers came up with some great stuff and we should have trusted them more. But the problem was, as soon as they started to come up with brilliant things, then they couldn't prove, according to traditional notions of assessment, that the kids had learned. And so then they swung back. And so that assessment conversation is really exciting, which is why your next special issue is also really exciting to me.
Okay, we got a couple of minutes. Can I take it away, Mary?
Take it away. Thank you.
First of all, let me take the 2 minutes to thank you. Thank you very much, and Zutra and Patrick for conceptualizing this special issue and bringing it to fruition. I hope that this is the beginning of a trajectory, and we can talk about where we take this further, and I'm sure you'll have ideas on how we can progress this. But thank you for following up with such a beautiful, I thought was a chat, for the last 90 minutes. This is being recorded, so we'll put it online on the ODLAA website so people can listen to it. And thank you everyone else, the authors, Tila, Glassman, and everybody else. I don't want to lose anybody by not mentioning their names, but every one of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 authors in the special issue. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you're excited by your work. And as Rob said, you've learned a lot. And I'm sure we all have learned a lot. And Mary, thank you very much for the 7 questions. As I was thinking, these are great comp questions. You could use at some other time. For your students in some other place. I thought they were very insightful, exciting, and it gave us a lot of chance to engage. And so, Julie, thank you very much for orchestrating this, and Mutwater and the association for supporting this initiative. So, anybody else wants to say anything before we close shop? Otherwise, it's over to you from me. Julie.
I think everyone in the chat has agreed it's been a very, very useful conversation, and I'm really looking forward and excited to the next webinar that we have. So we seem to be building quite a community. So thanks everybody for your participation. Mutawata, would you like to close?
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Hey, folks.
Yeah.
Bye. Nice to meet you all.
Thank you all.
Bye.
See you.